Hello, everyone. I wanted to take just a few moments of your time to do a debrief on Module 1 and also to provide a postscript for the Right to be Human case study. And I'm going to begin by kind of going over some of the concepts that we talked about during the on-campus session. I saw from your assignments that there was some confusion on the part of some of you in terms of some of the concepts, and I'm going to talk about those a little bit and hopefully clarify some of the questions that you had. Overall, I thought you all did a very nice job with the case analyses. I loved reading through the discussion, which I thought was very rich. A lot of insights were shared. So I'm hoping we can keep up that kind of momentum as we go through the course, because I think all of you have a lot to share with each other based on your own experience and also your wonderful insights. That said, let's talk a little bit about some of these concepts. I want to go back over the difference between process evaluation and outcome evaluation. And as you recall from the on-campus session, process evaluation really answers the question whether or not the intervention or program was implemented as it was intended. So fidelity is one primary question that the process evaluation will answer. But it also answers the question about quality. Were the products being delivered at the level at which they were intended? Number of groups, number of clients served, target population reached, etc. But also, was that done well? And here you might incorporate some qualitative data as well, like participant satisfaction measures, for example. And the example that I gave on campus was the material presented in the same number of sessions over the same time frame using the same methods? Did the program reach its intended audience? Outcome evaluation, on the other hand, is looking at whether or not something changed as a result of the program activities. And we look at these along a time continuum of short, intermediate, and long-term outcomes. So we're looking not just at whether things happened, but whether what happened actually made a difference. And here the example I gave you was, did the participants who participate in the program reduce their drug use? Again, did their behavior change? Did something happen because of the program? The other point that I wanted to make during the on-campus was that the outputs that you measure as part of a process evaluation should be those that are directly related to the outcomes that the program hopes to achieve. So you don't want to measure everything that happens in a program, and that's always a temptation. But as you're working through what needs to be measured, you need to ask yourself, how critical is this particular output or product with regard to whether or not this program can reach its intended long-term, short, intermediate, and long-term outcome goals. Another way to look at the levels of evaluative inquiry, process evaluation asks the question, is the program doing things right? Whereas outcome evaluation is asking, are they doing the right thing to get the kinds of changes or outcomes that they really want to see happen as a result of this program? Now, the question in your case analysis had to do with performance monitoring. And I recall that I mentioned this, and when going back through the slides, I realized we probably didn't spend a lot of time on this. And that's my fault. So I want to go back and kind of talk a little bit more about performance monitoring. This is a definition that I use, and basically it's the tracking of organizational activities to determine the extent to which the organization is able to achieve the goals it set for itself. And here it has through intentional actions within the context in which it works. So in other words, is the program able to do what it's thought it was going to do given the context in which it works? And that contextual piece is pretty important. So performance monitoring combines tracking of inputs, and a number of you in your responses to the case analysis mentioned inputs, as well as activities and outputs, those products that result from the activities. And actually, document whether or not activities occurred. And it's the monitoring of progress toward the desired outcomes. So again, if you're measuring outputs that are directly related to your outcomes, then that's going to help you to gauge your progress toward realizing those outcomes in the long term. Performance monitoring systems are structures within the organization or processes within the organization that are designed to track those measures of program performance, generally at regular time intervals. And it might be monthly, it might be more less often than that or more often than that, depending upon what it is they're tracking. For monitoring systems, you're aggregating that data to assess the overall operation of a program at a single point in time, which of course is your process evaluation. So your performance monitoring helps to feed that process evaluation, with the process evaluation being the interpretation. It's not just the measurement, but it's, what does this mean? Where does this take us? Where are we in terms of a benchmark of progress and implementation? Performance monitoring can occur at two different levels. One is tactical and the other is strategic. Tactical performance monitoring would be your day-to-day, real-time kind of monitoring where you have small feedback loops and you're making adjustments, on very short time frames. Strategic is more long-term. The process is pretty much the same except that you're aggregating those results over the organization and over an extended period of time in order to help learn more about how effective you're being, but also identify adjustments that need to be made at the organizational versus the individual level. So tactical plus strategic performance monitoring equals an operational performance management system. It's your overall way of tracking the performance of an organization over time, if that makes sense. And when you combine that with process and outcome evaluation, what you're really looking at is both program effectiveness, which is that ultimate outcome. Did it work? Did it achieve the outcomes? But also its efficiency within the context in which it operates. So it's looking at how they got to those outcomes, not just whether they got to them or not, which is, I think, an important distinction. And if you recall, I showed you or shared with you a little cartoon that evaluators have been sharing ever since I've been in the field, about the miracle that occurs in a program. And that's sometimes referred to as black box evaluation. It's what we do a lot of in public health when we do a pre and post. We take a measurement at the beginning and then we take a measurement at the end, and based on those two measurements, we then make a statement about whether or not a program is effective. What's missing, of course, is how that miracle occurred. What is it that led to that outcome that was realized at the end? Was it all those things that we planned and put into the program, or were there some other circumstances or factors that influenced that outcome that we hadn't planned on, that were unanticipated? Were there some things that we had to do to make the miracle occur? And this is where the case study, I think, really takes you through an actual case where that becomes very important, as you saw, and many of you identified in your case analysis. I think all of you did, actually. The importance of really focusing in on not just whether or not the sex workers were trained and condoms were distributed and behavior changed, but also the process of empowering the sex workers so that they then became more effective agents for the program. So let's talk about the right to be human just for a few moments. The most important thing, of course, is being able to understand and describe the program. And when we look at this particular program, it's easier said than done, I guess is what I would say. Because obviously the program that was originally on paper that the funder funded was very different from what the program became once it was actually implemented on the ground. So if you're describing a program, if you're trying to create a logic model for a program, these are some of the things, and again, this is somewhat of a review, that a fully described program or intervention addresses an identified need, very important, I think, in terms of the right to be human, has an identified target group, specific intended outcomes or objectives in mind. So it's going somewhere. It's therefore it has a purpose, and that purpose is based on an identified need. It includes activities that are then related to those outcomes and objectives, and it specifies the relationship between them. So basically, that's your logic model, or your logic model, I should say, is a tool to help you understand those things about the program. We kind of talked about what a logic model of the Shakti program would look like. Um, and that's based on asking, some of the following questions. What was the program's theory? What did the program developers believe was going to happen as a result of the inputs that they put into the program, as well as the activities that were implemented? And what were the assumptions behind that theory? But then the other piece of this particular case analysis is really the story of how that program evolved in order to meet those objectives. And also, the question of whether or not those original assumptions were even valid, and what adjustments had to be made to that program theory. As part of the process evaluation, it's really understanding the challenges that drove those changes that had to happen as the program was implemented. So here, performance evaluation would be very helpful. It's the documentation of what's going on as part of the implementation process. And there was a lot happening, as you know, in this particular case. Now here is a clarification point that I wanted to make because I saw there was some confusion around it. Identifying the overarching evaluation questions. Basically, what we're looking for here is what information do the evaluation users and other stakeholders need from this evaluation. So these are not the questions that you as the evaluator need in order to do this evaluation. Those are a different set of questions. This really gets to the purpose of this evaluation. What is it, why are you doing it? What is this? What is the information that these stakeholders want to get out of this? Why are they funding you to do this evaluation? And the other part of that is what kind of information is needed to really validate the links between the inputs, activities, outputs, and outcomes in the logic model, or in other words, the program's theory. How do you validate the purpose of this program and the assumptions that underlie it? And those are your overarching questions, because that's what your evaluation is going to attempt to answer. Those are the questions your evaluation will attempt to answer. So if you recall, I had put together a very basic Shakti program logic model based on the original design. And as we talked about during class, it's very simplistic and obviously does not account for all of the things that happened in that black box, the miracle that occurred in this program. And I think miracle is really an appropriate word to use here in terms of the major social changes that occurred as a result of some of the activities of that program. But the basic program theory, is laid out. It's very simplistic, straightforward, which is why the funders felt that they could just take this program, put it in a context similar to the original one, and it should work the same. We know that that didn't happen, and that these activities, in order to get to these activities, there was a whole nother set. And we talked about when you're doing a logic model, when you're trying to understand a program, it's important that you sequence out the activities so that you have a clear understanding of what the prerequisites were. Getting to the training of the sex workers, getting the sex workers even interested in participating in the training required some additional activities. Engaging the staff to be able to work with the sex workers. It's not, those things were not anticipated as activities that would be necessary in order to make this program work. So some of the performance indicators that you might track for Shakti. Again, performance indicators being those measures that would feed into an eventual process evaluation and help you benchmark where the program was in terms of its implementation process might be some of these things. You know, how many sex workers were recruited, number of training sessions, number of workers who completed training, number of condoms. Okay, all of those things obviously are very quantitative, and they do relate directly to the information that the stakeholders are looking for, which is preventing HIV, encouraging sex workers and their clients to use condoms more frequently, to get tested for HIV, and so forth and so on. What this list doesn't account for are the more qualitative things that had to happen in terms of performance, which could be documented. And I think, I don't remember which of you it was, asked whether or not performance indicators could be qualitative as well as quantitative. And the answer to that is yes. And I think, documenting, what were the challenges, and I don't have that on this list, but really working with staff and with participants to get a sense of what were some of the obstacles that they had to overcome and how did they overcome them. And that's really the gist of the story of the Right to Be Human case, isn't it? So the other question that was posed in the case evaluation were what indicators would you use for an outcome evaluation? And of course, some of you mentioned the empowerment and how that was obviously an unintended outcome. But, here again, we have to pay attention to our stakeholders and what was important to them. And the focus or purpose of Chakti was not to empower the sex workers. That was an unintended benefit of the program, wasn't it? The indicators for the outcome evaluation would have to include that information that your evaluation users were most interested in, which was the information related to HIV prevention, the use of condoms, the utilization of education materials by the sex workers, and so forth and so on, because that's what the evaluation users needed to know about this program in order to make decisions. Now, that doesn't mean that that's all that you would measure in terms of an outcome evaluation. As we talked about in class, the difference between goal-directed and goal-free. Well, goal-directed, that's all you'd measure. But a very good evaluation would also take into account those other benefits that were unintentional, but obviously very beneficial, both in terms of making the program more efficient in this context, but also in terms of the social changes that were a result. So, the question was, what were some of the indicators that you'd use for outcome based on the information? And based on the information in the case study, was the Shakti program successful? And again, many of you mentioned the fact that the sex workers had been empowered and that they had been able to create some social change as a result of that, and change attitudes within the community and highlight, some of the issues that they were most concerned about. And all of that, I agree with you, very important, and certainly does demonstrate that there was some success. But again, keep in mind that you're also having to meet the needs of those evaluation users, one of which was care. And while they were interested in the empowerment, they were mostly interested in the HIV prevention. So let's look at what the evaluation actually showed. And they did do an evaluation, and may surprise some of you actually. But 14 months after the program was implemented, they were able to document through surveys and interviews an increase in knowledge about the prevention of HIV, an increase in the reported use of condoms, a trial use of condoms in the last 24 hours, and more consistent use of condoms. All self-report, but still, I think, rather compelling in terms of the overall impact of that program. So what did CARE learn as a result? That even in a very conservative society, sex workers can be reached with a health intervention. So they were very happy. They saw that this program could work even in this kind of an environment, which is very conservative and not very supportive, in fact, stigmatizing for the sex workers who were the primary providers of the intervention. But even in that kind of a situation, the program could work. They also saw that a step-by-step approach to behavioral change using peer educators provided the means for behavior change, and it worked to improve condom use. So again, it validated one of those assumptions that peer education was an effective strategy. The other thing that happened, which was not mentioned in the case material that you read for your assignment, was that the peer educators were also involved in the evaluation in terms of collecting data and monitoring the outcome, so that they also were a part of that feedback loop and also had input in interpreting that evaluation, which, as we talked about in class, when you engage stakeholders fully, not only at the beginning, but also throughout the process, so that they can assist you in being able to interpret the data and may have insights that you as an evaluator may have missed. The other thing that was learned was that the resources were well worth the investment. So here was a return on investment. And I don't know exactly what they were measuring in terms of ROI, but obviously whatever return they were looking at, they felt was worth the money that was spent. And probably they were also looking at those social changes that happened as a result of some of the strategies that were undertaken to engage the sex workers, to empower them and to get them to actually accept the program and be able to follow through with the intervention. So, and I think this last quote, which is from the case report, and you see the citation at the bottom of the slide, integrating a rights-based approach into HIV/AIDS programming requires a greater understanding and application of national and human rights guidelines to determine the specific rights applicable to a given situation. So I think they're acknowledging that those contextual factors made a big difference. And the way that they know that is because it was documented as part of the evaluation process. And consideration then needs to be given to the nature and degree to which morbidity, mortality, risk behaviors, and vulnerability to HIV/AIDS are caused or exacerbated by insufficient respect for, protection of, fulfillment of human rights. So CARE was able to tie this back to a rights-based approach, which then changed their approach to implementing the intervention in other settings. So there you have it. I hope I was able to clarify for you some of the questions that you had, and I know I did put some of this in my comments to you individually, but I thought it might be helpful to just go over it one more time. As you're moving on to the next module, you'll be looking at focusing the evaluation design. Again, it's going to go over some of these concepts that we've already talked about. We'll also talk about evaluability assessment, which some of you may wind up doing actually for your individual projects. An evaluability assessment really is a preliminary step to doing any evaluation, or it can just be a standalone activity to help a program begin to think about how they can measure outcomes. And, some programs just aren't at a place where they even have a concept of what it is they're trying to accomplish, let alone how to measure it, and may not have the capacity in terms of data collection systems or data collection expertise to be able to collect the necessary data. An evaluability assessment provides recommendations and suggestions, kind of a blueprint for them moving forward as to how to increase their capacity for evaluation so that eventually they may, in fact, be able to execute one. So I hope you'll find that also informative. Please get in touch if you have any questions. I will likely be unable to communicate much within the next few days since I'm in Florida waiting for Irma. So hopefully by the end of next week, everything will be back to a reasonable normalcy and I'll be able to be back online with you. But I hope this answered a lot of the questions that you had. And I look forward to continuing through the course with you.